Hello, everyone. Good evening to all of those who have joined us from India. Good afternoon to those who have joined us from Europe, and good morning to all of you who have joined us from North America and that part of the world. It's a great pleasure for me to introduce three very distinguished, eminent panelists here for a very distinguished cause, a very popular book recently released titled as Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, authored by Mr. Anil Swarup. But before I come to the book and the panel, let me mention a few introductory remarks so that let me set the context. Professional life, either in government or in a corporation, often tests the uh, uh, ethical fiber of a person. In both the settings, a professional is a prime instrument. You would understand who is available with the organization to deliver. And if the professional fails to unclutter the ethical dilemmas and make the right choices, the consequences could be far reaching. Therefore, we have chosen to undertake this conversation with the author of Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, Mr. Anil Swarup, and two eminent discussants, whom I will introduce all the three to you in a moment. But what exactly we are seeking to do today, we have set out to seek clarity on some of the critical questions, such as what constitutes ethical conduct, what are the dilemmas and paradoxes which are inherent in when you work either in the government or outside. What are the temptations to deviate from ethical conduct, and how an individual can help oneself? To introduce myself, I am Navneet Sharma, and I'm in conversation with here Mr. Anil Swarup, a performer and bureaucrat and a best-selling author, and two eminent panelists, Andrew Stark, professor at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto, and he has been also a policy advisor in the Office of the Prime Minister of Canada, and Professor Rinaldas Gudauskas, Director General of the National Library of Lithuania. He has been a former advisor to the Prime Minister and President of Lithuania. Let me encourage all of you to please write your questions, observations, clarifications, whatever you may like to seek in the chat box. While you do that, let me introduce the three authors quickly. Mr. Sarup, as you know, is now equally well known as author, but his main professional life he spent in Indian Administrative Service in the Uttar Pradesh cadre, the largest estate in our country. He belongs to the 1981 batch. In his 38 years of career, he has served in various capacities and later went on to become Secretary to Government of India in two different ministries, coal and school education. Before joining the IAS, he worked as the Indian Police Service officer for 1 year, and he was also recipient of Director's Gold Medal for the Best Officer Trainee of his batch at the famous Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration. And in addition to his stints, which are very well recorded in his two books, in the union government at the state level, in the government of Uttar Pradesh, he has been education secretary. That was in the government of India, but in the government of India, he has been education secretary in the school, handling the school education portfolio, coal secretary, and more importantly, additional secretary in the cabinet secretariat, where at a time when there was something called policy paralysis happening. As additional secretary in the labor and empowerment uh, uh, ministry, he handled something very important, which I'm going to ask about the in health insurance policy. He has been export commissioner in the Ministry of Commerce and Industry, and as the district magistrate of Lakhimpur Kheri during the Babri Masjid Ram Janmabhoomi agitation, he has faced some of the tough times under the chief ministership of Mr. Kalyan Singh. Uh, as coal secretary, as you know, that was a time when coal scams were discussed in India, and Supreme Court of India cancelled more than 200 blocks allocated since 1993. He conducted coal auctions in a most transparent manner, which till today are celebrated as huge success. As an author, all of you know that his first book, not just a civil servant, received much appreciation last year. And very recently, just a week back, his second book, Ethical Dilemmas of a Civil Servant, was officially released. Welcome, sir. Welcome to this session. Before I invite you, let me ask you a quick question. As a civil servant, why you have chosen to really talk about ethics so prominently?
Basically, my understanding in the 38 years as a civil servant was that ethical behavior pays. It pays to be ethical, and that's why I thought I must convince those that are not very clear in the mind as to whether they should go in for ethical behavior, to demonstrate to them that it does pay. And that's the whole reason of writing this book, because there is this dilemma in minds of a number of civil servants. They look around, and with all the negativity around, they feel a bit despondent. And this was to cheer them up and tell them, yes, if you are ethical, you can still succeed in life, succeed big time.
Right. I think that's a very noble thought, sir. And it is already indeed encouraging a lot of people. I can see from the comments on social media and elsewhere how people are whole theme of celebrating ethics and mainstreaming ethical conduct in life is resonating with common people within and outside the government. Today we have Professor Andrew Stark as a discussant on the panel. Professor Stark is Professor of Strategic Management and Professor of Political Science at the Rotman School of Management. He holds a parallel appointment at the Monk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy, University of Toronto. His research interests include business, government, and medical ethics, corporate governance, business government relations, public administration, and public policy in North America. He is the author of numerous articles published in the American Political Science Review, Ethics, Political Theory, Harvard Business Review, amongst others. His books include The Consolations of Mortality, I beg your pardon, Making Sense of Death, which was published by the Yale University in 2016, Conflict of Interest in American Public Life, published by Harvard University Press in year 2000. And his work has been featured in publications such as the Wall Street Journal, Times Literary Supplement, and the New York Times. Professor Stark also has been a policy advisor to the Prime Minister of Canada. Professor Stark, before I open up the discussion, let me ask you a preliminary question. How this whole sense of morals, ethics, and at the interface of business and government, how this has attracted you to work, and your work is commendable, I must say, Professor Stark.
You're asking me what got me interested in this?
Yes, certainly.
Well, in a way, it was rooted in some of the issues that Anno talked about. I worked in the Prime Minister's office, as you noted, in the late 1980s and the early 1990s, and the government of the day faced a number of scandals, ethics issues, conflict of interest issues that caused it a great deal of political difficulty. And I became interested in trying to understand why that happened, and I embarked on writing this book that you mentioned, Conflict of Interest, as it turns out, in American public life, not Canadian public life, because there's a lot more to work with in America. And the notion that Anil just spoke about, whether ethics pays or not, while I have some caveats about that idea, I think fundamentally it's right. And certainly the reverse is right, which is that whether or not ethics pays, not being ethical not only doesn't pay, but it costs. And that's certainly the case in political life. Governments in Canada generally lose office because of ethics scandals. Bureaucrats can do foolish things and lose their jobs as a result of ethical issues. So I certainly agree with that basic strand. And it's also true broadly in business these days. We look at what's happening in America right now, and the Black Lives Matter movement is forcing businesses to clean up their act on issues of diversity and inclusion, and they will be rewarded for doing so, but also penalized for not doing so. So the ethics pays motif is also visible there. As I say, I have some caveats about that idea too, but we don't have to get into those right now. But that's my basic strand is one of agreement with Anna on this issue.
Right. I think that's very clear that ethics as a virtue is very generic, very central to human life, and across boundaries it holds importance. And the second discussant today, Professor Rinaldas Gudauskas, he is Director General at the National Library of Lithuania, which is also the Parliamentarians Library in Lithuania. Formerly, he has been an academic as well as a civil servant. As an academic, he has been a university professor, but he has also held two important positions, formerly as advisor to the Prime Minister of Lithuania and later as advisor to the President of Lithuania. He is an expert on knowledge management, information management, contemporary management, strategic management, and he has advised government and private sector people equally, not only in Europe but also outside. His lecturing circuit also has been globally very, very wide, where he has lectured in Lithuania, outside the Lithuania, within Europe, and I've had occasions to host him in India and this part of the world. Welcome, Professor Gudauskas. How do you see the importance of ethics as a former civil servant, as an academic? How important it is to you?
It's crucial importance, of course. Navneet, thank you for such a lot of information about myself, but it's not so important. It was very interesting to read your book, honest author, and it was very interesting for me to remember my times in government and my times in academics. And maybe can I tell just a few examples from my life in prime minister's and president's office? Okay, Navneet?
Right.
Okay. Then I started my job. First of all, I became advisor to president of Lithuania. It was my first position. And I was at the time academician, dean of faculty of communication. And I have asked, what are the limits of my empowerments? He was smiling, actually. And he, after that, he has told me, you should keep going until you will be stopped. For me, it was at the beginning not very clear, but when I have started to do strategic projects related to information society, knowledge economy issues, well, it became clear. I had full trust, I had empowerment, and I get good results. We organized first World Information Technology Forum in Lithuania. I was leader of knowledge economy project of World Bank, etc., etc. So it was important. But speaking about mission, I also need to make a point that my prime minister later, first he was president, after the prime minister, he has told, I need advisor. I don't need a setter or agreeer. You are better in some competences than I. That's why I need you. Later, it became even more clear for me when I understood how important are my advices, because after that, state can do some good things or not very good performance, etc. So,
as the torchbearer of ethics, it can be an extremely important role. And to all the 200 plus people who have already joined us, let me at this point in time invite Mr. Swaroop to give us a crisp sense of what exactly has been captured in the book. I have gone through, but I'm not going to reveal much about it. I would let each one of you hear from him. It's a fascinating book, I must say. Over to you, sir. We would like to know more about the book.
Thank you very much, Navneet, for those kind words. This book actually is an outpouring of a practitioner. If you look at it from purely theoretical point of view, you'll find many loopholes in it. It doesn't fit into any theoretical model, because for me, ethics is not what is understood traditionally as ethics. For me, ethics is very personal to an individual. So ethics can vary from one person to another person. It can vary from one place to another place. It can vary from one country to another country. It can vary within a time frame also, from one time to other. So whereas, the general value system could be agreed upon by a society, but for an individual, you learn as you go along. And as whoever has read the book will discover that I also learned as I went along. In fact, at the end of some chapters, there's still unanswered questions. So all answers are not known. So as I said, it is not a theoretical outpouring. It's a practitioner's outpouring on what I actually faced. I'm not saying what I did was right. There could be better solutions. What I am trying to say in my book is how I responded to a particular situation. There were certain choices that were available. I made conscious choices. To begin with, in the earlier part of my career, I was not very sure. The dilemma was there in my mind as well. Objectively, there was dilemma. Objectively, there will always be a dilemma. There will be choices. But if you evolve in a particular manner, and that's what I try to demonstrate in my book, then it ceases to be a dilemma in your mind. Then you're very clear-headed. There are choices available, and you know what choice you got to make. And in making that choice, you are aware that you will face the consequences. The point that I'm trying to make here is that given the evolving environment, there is a price to be paid either way, whether you follow an unethical life or you follow an ethical life. Then a choice has to be made by a civil servant, and I limit myself to civil servant, though of course the feedback that now I'm getting is what has been written in the book could be applicable to any domain. But I limit myself to civil servant because my exposure has been as a civil servant, where I came across such situations where, as I keep saying, certain choices had to be made. So in a particular case, I put the president of the ruling party district ruling party behind the bars. A choice had to be made. The choice was that if I do put him behind, I would be transferred out. The other option would have been if I leave him, there could be a riot in the district. So I took a choice. I spoke to my wife and we decided, okay, we'll take this choice. That's a very conscious choice. We are prepared for the consequences. And fortunately, in that particular case, it worked. In another case, it didn't work. So it's not all, my stories that I narrate are not all success stories, so to say. There were failures as well. But you learn from your failures, you learn from your mistake, but you don't compromise on your value system. You evolve. Initially, my initial feeling, which now when I reflect upon it, I thought most of the politicians are corrupt or wrong, which was absolutely absurd. As I evolved, I realized they have their own limitations. They have their own constituency. They have their own problems. I started appreciating their point of view. And I came to, that's why if you look at the book, you'll find that in the initial period of my career, I was transferred quite frequently. Thereafter, I was not making compromises. What I was trying to do is to understand the other person, because without understanding the context, you can't be ethical in a vacuum. You exist in a context. And the ultimate objective is to deliver things on the ground. This is one of the chapters I bring out, that honesty is a necessary condition for a successful officer, but certainly not a sufficient condition. He has to perform, deliver on the ground. And for that delivery, you have to understand the environment. Pure honesty, you can be honest on yourself and to hell with everyone else. I don't espouse that philosophy. I say, yes, you have to be ethical in your way, but you can't ignore the surrounding. You have to work along. So the bottom line is, at least for a civil servant, to deliver things on the ground. So there is a chapter where I'm actually doing an unethical thing of threatening the chairman of SIDB to waive away interest of my organization. I do that. Now, when I reflect on it, probably that was not purely ethical of me to do. But in the context in which I was, where, we were virtually getting killed, I was being practical. So that's why I say the book is about a practitioner's outpouring into how he interprets ethics. And I nowhere in the book do I say that's the way forward for everyone. I say that's an option that I took. I am happy with it. If someone else feels he can, that's one. The other thing that I'm trying to bring forth in the book is, because of the general environment or a belief in negativity in terms of only unethical people succeeding in the society or in the bureaucracy, I'm trying to demonstrate and give examples after examples that through ethical behavior also you can succeed. So success is not the monopoly of dishonest. Dishonest people also get caught. I know for sure, I've not written this in the book, 2 chief secretaries of the state of UP were sent to jail for what they did. So with the ever increasing awareness, with social media, with media becoming very, very visible, it is better, it is practical. And the final point that I'm trying to drive home in the book is that it is practical to be honest. It's not merely ideal. It's not on an idealistic pedestal that you should be. No, I'm not saying. Nowhere am I saying you should be this, you should be that. What I'm saying is that is. And from that is, and that's what is I'm trying to establish, that since it has happened, it can happen. So without examples, if I just pontificate and say, you should do this, you should do that, this will be only disseminating gyan all over the place. And I'm not, pardon my using those words, gyan is knowledge, pure knowledge. So it's not academic in nature. You can derive certain theoretical postulates out of what I've said, but this is not theory at all. This is a practitioner's delight. I'll stop here. I would rather interact with you and respond to your question. Thank you for inviting me here. Thank you very much.
That brings me to the fundamental question. If I put myself in the shoes of an audience, what exactly constitutes an ethic? What exactly it is. Let's start with some of the fundamentals, sir. I want to start with you. If you have explained, you have engaged with the whole issue of ethics in greater detail, but at the definitional level, at the day-to-day understanding level, what does it mean to you, sir? Before I come to your discussions.
Very, very simple. Your understanding of what is right and what is wrong. Period. That's it. That's what ethic is. And this is determined by your value system, which get in itself determined by your environment, your parents, your siblings, your friends, your school. You come across, meet them, and you develop your own sense of right and wrong. And it's that sense of right or wrong that brings in ethics. That if you feel that is right, you think that it is right, this is wrong, that's ethically right and ethically wrong. It has nothing to do with law, because law is common for everyone. If you violate a law, you go behind the bars, action gets taken. There is no physical action, so to say, against you. So ethical domain is much broader than, law is only codified ethics to a certain extent. Ethics is much beyond it. It's your sense of right and wrong, which evolves over a period of time. And as I said in the beginning, your sense of right or wrong also changes over a period of time. You may think a particular thing to be right at some point in time. It's a very simple thing. Sometimes you are a non-vegetarian, and over a period of time, you start discovering that, no, this is not right. You change it and you become a vegetarian. Similarly, you protect your subordinate. Now, if you don't protect your subordinate, no case will be registered against you. If you protect them, also no case. So it's ethical, your own value system, which pushes you into protecting your subordinates at a particular cost. So you make a choice that even at that cost, I'm protecting this officer, come what may. So there's no action against you, so to say, but you're creating a value system that is determined by the value system that you evolve over a period of time. So I hope I gave you a definition of ethics.
Absolutely, that makes eminent sense, sir. Professor Gudauskas, how in your life, how you have seen this sense of right and wrong being developed in an individual, whether it is about you or hundreds of individuals who may have worked with you. How do you generalize this evolution or development of sense of right and wrong, which we are talking today as ethical conduct?
Well, Navneet, I am a very practical person. If you permit me, I will try to tell you my personal experience, because this distinguished author just told it is practical to be honest. I had such case. Actually, in my life, in my civil servant life, it happened something like personal scandal. Immediately, next day, I resigned because of possible damage to government, to my prime minister, etc., etc. So it was not easy solution for me, but it was right solution. After 1 year, I was again invited to be part of governmental missions, and it was, I think, not expected, but it happened. So you see. So not about theory, but speaking about general things, well, it's sensitive what I'm telling to you, but you understand me. I think public service is just for persons who are able to adapt a moral behavior despite unfavorable conditions. If you can do that, you can serve society. If you cannot not do that, you probably are wrong person for public service. Maybe that's all.
Right. Well, that makes a lot of sense, Professor Gudauskas, because having that tough fiber, having that tough filter in your mind and your conduct is extremely critical, whether you are a public servant or a high ranking corporate executive, because both impact a number of lives. So therefore, I think it's very important. Professor Stark, you have examined this question in variety of forms, both in your service to the government and as a professor. You've examined a number of conflict of interest matters in America. To you, what does it mean? What constitute ethics, and how do you see that this comes into play an individual's life? What's your definitional take on this?
Well, let me answer that by referring again to Anil's wonderful book. I mentioned that I'll quote a Canadian author, Margaret Atwood, who once said that novelists and bureaucrats are the reverse of each other. Novelists spend their lives pretending that non-existent people are real, and bureaucrats spend their lives pretending that real people are non-existent. Now, she was kidding, but one of the things that struck me about Anil's book was how he pretended he didn't do that. He treated real people as if they were real and tried to deal with their problems on the ground, as Anil says, within a framework of rules and a regime that sometimes lent itself to helping them, and sometimes he had to figure out creative ways of using those rules. And one of the things in the book that I mentioned this when we talked earlier amongst ourselves, that I liked about the book were the chapters that ended in questions, where Anil talks about something he did, but then wonders whether it was the right thing to do or not. And so that leads me to say that when we talk about developing a value system over time, that's important, but the value system you develop over time isn't always going to tell you what the right or the wrong thing to do is in any given situation, because those values will come into conflict. But looking over the cases, and I will tell you what I think ethics is. It's a form of, I think of ethics as moral reasoning. I don't define it as a creed or a set of principles. I define it more as a way of thinking. And I associate that way of thinking primarily with John Rawls, the American philosopher, who coined a term that he called reflective equilibrium. And reflective equilibrium means you look at a bunch of cases that are difficult ones where you're torn as to what the right thing to do is. You try and figure out principles that explain your own intuitive, your gut. So you get some principles out of it, then you apply them to other cases. Maybe those cases complicate the principles. Maybe the principles don't entirely work for those other cases. So you have to amend those principles or values until you reach a point of equilibrium, where you think you've figured out what it is that's really explaining your intuitive or your gut. But you need to do that. You need to be able to concretize your intuitions in principles and assure yourself that they also apply to other cases that you might encounter, not just the one that you are dealing with at the moment. I think many of the cases in Anil's book, and one of the reasons I like it so much, is that it provokes that kind of thought, because there are ambiguities that invite you to say, well, why do I feel this way in this case, but not that way in this other case, which is very similar? What's going on here? And you can tease out your own values or principles and have a much clearer sense of what it is that is of value to you. So, and I would call that moral reasoning, and that's what I identify first and foremost with an ethical approach to public service or the business life or whatever else.
Well, that's theoretically also fairly rigorous, Professor Stark. Let me get back to Mr. Swaroop and help our audience understand through some examples let's take the setting of a government organization, how these dilemmas and paradoxes emanate, and how they provide temptations to deviate from ethical conduct, and how what kind of challenges can they face. Sir, give us a your audience today has representation of government, business, academics. So therefore, through the three panelists, I would like to understand the ethical dilemmas question from the government point of view, from academic and from business point of view. Starting with you, sir, how in government setting, the kind of politico bureaucratic ecosystem you work in, what kind of dilemmas and paradoxes it throws upon you, sir?
Okay, they can be very simple and they can be extremely complex. Let me give two extreme examples of a very simple dilemma and a bit of complex dilemma. The simple dilemma was when I had put in about 10, 11 years of service, and I had done my stint as district magistrate and come to Lucknow as special secretary to the chief minister of the state, Mr. Kalyan Singh, and also his director information. There was a by-election to take place on the following after 2 days or 3 days, and there was a discussion going on at his residence early in the morning, in which the chief secretary was there, the director general of police was there, and I was there. And the chief minister was very agitated that 7 meetings had been lined up, election meetings, and he said that he's not well and he doesn't want to go to the 7. He wanted to cancel the last 2 meetings. Now, when he looked agitated, both the chief secretary and DGP were vehemently agreeing with him, nodding their head. Yes, sir, how can you go there? You are not well. I heard them out for about 2-3 minutes and I couldn't hold myself. I was pretty young at that point in time. I believe that I still am, though I'm not. So at that point in time, I thought of butting in. So I told the chief minister, sir, I was district magistrate just a few days ago. And when a chief minister comes to a district, there's a lot of preparatory work that happens. There are a lot of expectations amongst people, though it's a political decision. But my suggestion to you would be that even if you go for a minute, don't speak anything, just go there, just say hello to them and then you go. He looked at me very angrily and said, how can I go? The moment he said, how can I go? The chief secretary started nudging me, big time nudging, and asking me to keep quiet. But I carried on. I said, sir, my job is to give you the advice. And it's your call, sir. If you want to go, you can. If you don't want to go, you can still take a call. And then there was a pin drop silence for about 15-20 seconds. And in that 15-20 seconds, the chief secretary continued to nudge me. After 15 seconds, the chief minister just speaks out. He says, Anilji, you are right. And the moment he said, Anilji, you are right, the chief secretary immediately stopped nudging me and started nodding. Yes, sir, he's absolutely right. So there was this dilemma in my mind, whether I should speak amidst, these senior people. And I decided, okay, I'll say what I have to say. And I said it. It may have backfired. So be it. I was prepared for the consequences. Simple dilemma. But, chief minister recalled this many years down the line when he became chief minister again, and he wanted me to become his secretary. And he narrated this incident to me, telling me, this is why I want you to be here. I want my critic to be with me. So this was a simple dilemma. Now, there was a complex dilemma. And this came about 4 months before I superannuated, before I retired, right at the end of my career. And this dilemma was that the CBSE examination were happening and a paper leak had happened. Now, I don't want to go into the details written in my book that the education mafia is worse than coal mafia in India. And the publishing mafia was up against the chairman said CBSE because she had stopped publication of books, which was not the job of CBSE. And crores of rupees had been lost of publishers. So they wanted to get rid of her somehow. So they found in this an opportunity of running after her. They got the media after her and they said she's responsible for this leak. Unfortunately, around that time, my father was not well. I was attending to him in Dehradun when the chairman CBSE spoke to me and said, this is the crisis. Now, I told her very clearly, you talk to the media and tell them the facts. Which are the facts? The best way to go about it is. Why conceal anything? So she spoke to the minister and minister did not permit her to speak. Next morning, I was bringing my dad on an ambulance from Dehradun to Delhi, about 5-6 hours drive. And on the way, I tried to convince the minister to allow Anita Karwal to talk to the media. He did not relent. But at the end of the day, he said, okay, you give them a bite. Now that single bite created disaster because She had to explain things she didn't. She gave a bite. By evening, when I arrived in Delhi and I got my father admitted in a hospital, it was a full-blown crisis. Next morning, I went to meet the minister. Now, the moment I met the minister, he said, we'll have to shift Anita Karwal out. She has to be eased out. I was shocked because here was an officer who had no fault. There was no fault of hers. Now, the dilemma for me was, should I allow her to go or should I take on the minister? Because I have had experience in the past where I was myself transferred in order to protect an officer. I did that early part of my life. But, on this occasion, I decided I will tell the minister what I knew. But one thing I did was, I must confess that I've become a bit matured to package my conversation in a manner that it became acceptable to the minister. That's very important. That I tell my colleagues that you don't have to blast everything. You don't have to fight with the minister. Understand his limitation and speak the language that he understands. So what language I spoke? I told him, sir, right now, the whole media is after the chairman CBSE. She's a buffer between you and the media. The moment you shift her out, the entire media will be after you and they will ask for your blood. This clicked immediately. And he said, Haan, Nidhi, aap sahi keh rahe hain. But the next problem was, who's going to address the media? They were very, very aggressive. Because he normally used to address the media. As secretary, I was not. He used to address. On this occasion, he was not ready. So I volunteered. I said, what will they do to me? They will not lynch me in public. What they will ask me embarrassing question, I'll face it. So I took that on. That, of course, is narrated in my book. So the point that I'm trying to make here is, the first was a simple ethical dilemma. Second was much more complex, had a national consequence for the minister, consequence for me. It was already hitting headlines. All the media was talking about it. So this much more difficult decision. By which time I had become very clear-headed. I was clear in my mind. To me, there was no dilemma. I knew what was the way forward. So once you are clear in your mind, despite objective existence of dilemmas, you don't feel the pressure of those dilemmas because you have that clarity. And it happened time and again thereafter. It didn't really matter to me because I was clear in my mind what path I'll adopt and I was prepared to pay a price. I did pay a price if you read the book on a few occasions. I did. So be it. I don't call it a price. It's learning. You learn as you go along. So a couple of instances.
Right. I think that's a very practical, very nuanced view of one simple and one slightly complicated dilemma, which has wider ramifications. If I can request you, Professor Stark, to give our audience an understanding of, corporate dilemmas when at the board level or at the executive level, how people can be hard pressed for decisions. And let me give to the panel some finding. In the meantime, when the three of you were speaking, we posed two questions to the audience. First question was, do you face ethical dilemmas? 87% of your audience says yes, they face day-to-day level variety of dilemmas. And the second question, which of the following areas best represent the toughest ethical dilemmas you face? So 9% people have said the first one, 9% is helping others earn money through illegitimate ways. That's one area of ethical dilemma. The second area, 19% people said utilizing budget in areas where it ought not to be spent is the second one, 19%. 23%, or rather now 22%, because voting is going on, giving employment to not so deserving people is an important area. Now 26% people say that this is an area where a lot of ethical dilemma is presented to them. 21% people are saying protecting people who should be punished. 20% people are saying that's where they are posed. And the other variety of non-monetary favors which are asked from them, that's again a very large, 28% people are saying non-monetary favors is a category where people are reporting that ethical dilemmas are presented to them. Professor Stark, please give us a business perspective to the entire discourse on ethical dilemmas. It will be great if you give us a perspective of something at the board level and something at the executive level, how these ethical dilemmas can really impact a life, or rather all the lives which your decisions impact.
Okay, well, let me give you two examples, and they each illustrate a different kind of problem. One is the problem of what do you do when your values don't give you a clear indication of what the right course of action is. And the second is, what do you do when the values you have do tell you pretty clearly what the right thing to do is, but the incentives that you face are overwhelmingly to do the wrong thing? And business ethicists talk about both of these. So an example of the first, and one kind of example that I'm very interested in right now in our sort of ravaged, globalized world, is the challenges that are faced by multinationals who are doing businesses in developing countries, but that are sourced or that find their home in developed countries. And they find themselves in situations where norms or moral values of the that exist in the developing country are different from those that exist in the developed country. So a multinational might be hosted in a country where gender equity in the workplace is considered morally right, but doing business in a culture where that's not the case, and where there's an expectation that men will be doing business, and it would be a violation of local norms for women from that multinational to be sent on a team to do business in that place. Or there may be different health standards. One of the cases that business ethicists talk about is the case of Ciba Geigy, which marketed a dysentery drug in enteroviaform in India in the 1970s. The drug is considered unsafe in America, but not in India, where the problem of dysentery was considered more serious than the side effects of the drug. But there was a lot of debate about this. So the dilemma is, on the one hand, you're a multinational that comes from Canada or the United States, where there are certain moral norms of gender equity or pharmaceutical safety, and those are important. On the other, you have to respect the norms and values of other countries that may not be identical to yours. That's a dilemma that boards and CEOs are dealing with quite a bit these days. So that's an example of a dilemma in which your values come into conflict. An example where your values should be pretty clear, but the incentives go in the other direction. I think of the case of Enron, which you may know of, the energy management company that went bankrupt because in the first part of the 2000s. And one of the problems was that the executives of the company were receiving not just a salary, but stock options as a compensation, which gave them an incentive to manipulate the share price in ways that would advantage them personally. They knew it was wrong to do that, but they had an incentive, financial incentive, to do the wrong thing. After the scandal occurred, the rewarding executives with stock options of that sort went out of favor. So one of the results was that those incentives disappeared, but it was still the case that the executives, even though they didn't have the incentive through stock options to manipulate the share price, they still, as salaried executives, were expected to keep the share price up. But you can't get rid of a salary as well as a stock option. And the lesson I draw from this is you should try and reduce all of the incentives for bad behavior that you possibly can, but you'll never get rid of them all. And so at one level, you have to rely on the moral values of executives in situations of the sort that we're talking about in these kinds of confrontations. So those are two examples. They both were board level and senior executive level concerns.
I think in some sense, Professor Stark, that reminds me of the Golden Goose tale of, famous tale, which I think almost in every culture we are told as kids. But nevertheless, I think humans refuse to learn. And I'm also looking at the chat box, a number of questions coming in. But before I take up questions, let me go across to Professor Gudauskas and ask him and give his, take on these moral dilemmas, ethical dilemmas, which are presented, and how we come across, how we face those dilemmas, with some examples, if you're able to help our audience from some European examples, maybe.
Well, first of all, I'm repeating myself, but I'm very impressed by the book which I have in my hands. And here I see dilemma. Knowledge or attitude. I citate Kavada success, yes? So if you permit me. Attitude often matters more than skill or intelligence in creating high-performance organization. In my life, I also had consultancy and training roles for non-governmental organizations. It's very important because my mission was to make for them public policy, advocacy, and lobbying. And it was all possible types, small and medium-sized business, green organizations, etc., etc. And I totally agree that in creating a high-performance organization, attitude matters, is priority. Knowledge is very important, but integrity of attitude and knowledge is right mix, which makes sense of purpose and helps you to reach right destination. So I have a lot of experiences, but also they are related with business organizations. And I can tell you that, for example, I had experiences in working with United States companies, IT companies, they are high performers. I had experience in working with South Korean companies, Samsung and LG, but corporate responsibility, I think it's almost all general principles are maybe the same even for civil servant or for corporate executive managers.
Right, right. And here is a question which I'm tempted to pick up from the chat box. At what stage ethics, morals or values, etc., should be inculcated in the life of an individual? Primary school, high school, or college? Clearly, this question is coming appears to be coming from an academic. Well, I would like to pose this question to all the three experts on the panel, starting with you, sir, Mr. Swaroop. Do you think there is a particular age, or this is a work in progress all your life?
I'm glad that the term inculcated has been used. It could have been used, that word taught could have been used. Because when you talk of primary school and secondary school, we believe in teaching. To me, ethics can never be taught. It has actually to be inculcated. And it gets inculcated right from the time the child gains consciousness. He watches his parents very closely. He sees how they are behaving, then his siblings, then his friends, then schoolmates, then his teachers. And he inculcates those values from the people that he comes in touch with. I don't think ethics can ever be taught. It can never be taught. It has to be inculcated. And one reason why I wrote this book was not to teach ethics or pontificate about ethics, but to demonstrate certain practices through which a person can relate. That's very important. By teaching, it's very difficult to relate what is being taught, but by experiencing it. And secondly, if you see around yourself that if you live in people who have ethical values and pursue ethical values, the chances are that you will imbibe those values. A lot depends on how it gets. So I'm so glad, despite the fact that the terms primary school, secondary school were used, the term inculcate was used. Actually, it has to be imbibed. Ethical values have to be imbibed. And best imbibing, especially in civil servants, it comes through demonstration. You may say that do this, do this, do this. If it gets demonstrated that ethical life pays, then the chances of those values getting imbibed or inculcated are much more. They may still not be imbibed. But the best way of going about demonstrating the effect of ethics and the positive impact of ethics is the way forward for people becoming ethical. To me, that's the way forward. Some of it, I mean, you can tell about ethics, but demonstration has to be there.
I remember, sir, a few years back when I met you first, you told me something that people say monitoring ठीक से नहीं हो रही है. I mean, I continue to wonder whether monitoring is the solution to improve performance or somebody's inbuilt GPS is the solution. That's something we really have to look at the performance questions also.
In 38 years of my civil service career, I never monitored. Because monitoring is, assuming that I am wiser than the others. You become a facilitator. I mean, how? And, one of the questions that I'm raising in the book is, why shouldn't a man perform? Everyone wants to perform. Who doesn't want to perform? The job of the leader is to find out what objective conditions or what environmental conditions should I create for him to work. There would be exceptions, 1 or 2% who would not do even then. But my experience tells me, you give the right environment, almost everyone performs. But you have to understand that subject, that person very clearly. What gets him moving, rather than general monitoring of why aren't you doing it and using a danda.
Right. Professor Gudauskas, what to your mind, in terms of creating conducive conditions, there are two questions which we are dealing here. One is, at what stage inculcating these values is a right way, and second is, how can leaders really create conducive conditions for ethical considerations at work? Professor Gudauskas?
Okay, maybe my point will be, there is such expression, ethical leaders do the right things at the right time for the right reasons in general, yes. It's easy to say, but difficult to tell. Actually, I think also about ecosystem in which we are living, and if it is necessary to develop such values as trust, honesty, consideration, fairness, as early as it is possible, possibly in the family, in the school, and after that to develop into organizations or other structures. And in general, my understanding is that those values are leading you through all the life, and they don't change. If they don't change, you are having chance for making good not only for yourself but also for society. For me, ethical living or leading, because basically one of my topics is executive leadership, it means to take courage and conviction. Again, it is easy to say, but complicated to do, but you need to do it every day in general.
Right, right. Professor Stark, if I come to you and ask you the same set of two questions, that inculcating the value, is there a right stage, and what can leaders do about it? So that this will give us this will complete the understanding of how the external atmosphere can really support ethical considerations.
Well, I'll just echo what the others have said. Certainly, inculcating or values, either by example or more directly at an early age and on. And there's a lot of writing in the developmental moral psychology of children and adolescents that suggests this is very important. There's sort of a kind of it's not a joke, but it's an observation that ethics courses in business schools, where you talk about various arguments and issues and dilemmas, often do nothing more than provide the students with ways of rationalizing bad behavior. So they now have the arguments to explain, and that's true if they haven't, up until the point they've come to business school as children or adolescents or whatever, develop the moral core that will lead them to use those insights and arguments properly as opposed to improperly. So I certainly agree with that. As far as leaders are concerned, I mean, one of the things that is coming out of the racial controversies in America right now is have paid lip service in their corporate value statements or in other ways to inclusivity and diversity in the workplace, but haven't really acted on it. They haven't demonstrated their commitment to it. There are studies that show that corporations that have lovely value statements but don't implement them their share price isn't affected, but companies that do implement their value statements in a demonstrable way get a boost in their share price as a result. And in fact, it's probably counterproductive in some ways to have a lovely set of values that you talk about, but if you don't implement them, then it might be worse than not having said anything to begin with, because it makes leadership look hypocritical and it corrodes morale. So certainly the importance of leadership, not simply talking and uttering the right sentiments, but demonstrating them and enacting them is very well established, certainly in writing on business ethics, and I'm sure that I don't see any reason why government should be any different on that score.
Right. And as we are coming to the close of the session, I want to now, we have discussed about the external environment, but Professor Kudauskas, I want to come to you and ask about the internal, the inward journey, where how can an individual fit some kind of GPS, some kind of self-navigational tool? I know a lot of this will come from the moral values you acquire from family and your surroundings, but let's say even if you may not have the right values to begin with, as you grow, your experiences can train you, can teach you a lot. So how can a person acquire a self-navigation tool or a GPS to really guide oneself as one grows old?
Very good and very difficult question. Okay, but in general, my understanding is that a leader's choices are also influenced by their moral development, self-development in general. If you are doing it constantly, so you can pretend to ethical leadership, which is directed by respect for ethical beliefs and values of and for the dignity of the rights of others. Maybe it's most important point which I would like to point out. Dignity, respect of the others.
Right. Professor Stark, what, in your experience, how this GPS could be acquired, how one could really self-navigate, and I'm asking this question more from the inward journey point of view and not really an external perspective.
Well, I guess the one thing I would may partially bear on your question, but the one thing that we haven't touched on and that I just want to point out is that the business ethics and government ethics is the short term versus the long term. It's often the case that ethics pays, but in the long term, not necessarily in the short term. So, for example, the Ford Motor Company introduced seat belts into its cars in 1950. Nobody bought them because nobody understood the importance of seat belts. It was only until the 1960s and 70s that became something that paid. Similarly, I think of John F. Kennedy's book, Profiles in Courage, a book about political figures who took the right decision at a certain time and paid for it. It didn't pay them; they paid for it. But over time and in the long run, public opinion came to honor them for what they did. So part of a GPS is the ability to understand the short-term, long-term difference and to have some faith in, if you are faced with a very difficult dilemma, to look at it in those terms and use the knowledge that in the long term you will be vindicated or rewarded, or the possibility of that as a way of stiffening your spine in the short run.
That's really, really important, because one has to have that perspective of long term. Let me come to you, Mr. Sarup, for closing remarks for this GPS question. How can one travel inward and have this long term? Beautifully put, Professor Stark, by you. How can we really build this long term perspective in mind, travel inward, and give ourselves to a GPS or a self navigational tool, sir?
I couldn't agree with Professor Stark more than what, it's phenomenally well put. But what he's talking about is the why of ethics, not the how of ethics. And the fundamental question that I'm trying to address in the book is the how part of it. And pardon with my apologies to the two other panelists, I'll use a few Hindi couplets that I've used in the book to illustrate and demonstrate the how of it. Because why is understood? Because it comes out beautifully, as Professor Stock says, that in the long term, it does benefit. It is only to be somehow understood within you. Now, through the book starts with a couplet, an Urdu couplet. मुख्तसर सी जिंदगी के अजब से अफसाने हैं, या तीर भी चलाने हैं, परिंदे भी बचाने. This is the quintessential dilemma that the officer faces. And the book ends with another couplet. And that's where the answer is actually. खुदी को कर बुलंद इतना कि हर तकदीर से पहले खुदा बंदे से खुद पूछे बता तेरी रजा क्या है. Ultimately, it boils down to the individual himself. And this emanates from an understanding that you cannot do anything to anybody else. We may believe that we are superpowers or what. You can't. If anything that you can do is to yourself. And by hiding behind umr bhar yahi bhool karta raha ghalib, धूल चेहरे पे थी आईना मलता रहा. So by blaming others for what you are, you're never going to progress. So the focus has to be you. Now, how do you focus on yourself? By attempting to understand the pros and cons of what you're doing. And that's where what Professor Stock says. Once it gets demonstrated to me that I stand to benefit by following a particular path, I follow that path. Now, I have to look for those examples. Now, there is another choice available to any individual, more so a civil servant, whether I'm looking at civil servants who have succeeded despite being unethical, or whether I'm looking at civil servants who succeeded being ethical. Whether I'm looking at civil servants who failed because they were unethical, there are other set of civil servants who were ethical yet failed. Now, amongst these categories, the choice again is mine. Who am I looking at? And the ultimate choice is that of the individual. Once he starts perceiving the benefits out of following a particular path, then his job is done. That's what he requires to do. He has to sit, look within himself. And in India, it should not be much of a problem. We believe in that. We believe in introspection. We believe in looking inwards. The answers come from within you, not without you. Without can only influence, but the real answers are within you. And I use this word both in this and the previous book. There is that inherent feeling of goodness when you do something good. And that can't be defined or explained. Look for that. What gives you a kick? I use the word kick in my book. What gives you a kick? And kick would vary from individual to individual. I can't define what you get kicked out of or what you get kicked out of. Because you decide what is good for you. No one else can decide for you. They can suggest, explain, whatever. But ultimately, it is your inherent inside feeling. And I have been through that. In some of the examples that I've given, I call them my Bharat Ratnas, the highest award. Because that's the kick. I still remember. I get goosebumps. This is what I did. I love those moments. So what are the moments that you love? If those moments are ethical moments, then you will follow an ethical path. And you can do that. It depends on what you recall. The good moments of your life, they are ethical moments.
I think that's wonderfully concluded. And to all of you, to Professor Stark and Professor Gudauskas, I assure you that I'm going to give you, to best of my ability, the English translations of the Urdu couplets.
What they're in the
Mr.
book.
Sarup just mentioned.
They're in the book.
They're in the book. So excellent.
Yeah, translated in English.
So do refer to those, and to all the audience and to the two discussants, I must mention that Mr. Sarup has also a wonderful initiative in the form of Nexus of Good. I'm sorry. The whole philosophy behind Nexus of Good is that if wrong connotations, if wrong people can come together, why can't good become a force? That is what Mr. Sarup has started as Nexus of Good. With this note, I bring the session to a closure. Thank you very much, Mr. Anand Swarup, Professor Andrew Stark, Professor Rinaldas Gudauskas, and all the audience. And I can see from the number, I think about 210 people have connected with us. To all of you, in the Corona times, I think this is a wonderful, Corona, if you ask me, Corona is all about pause and reflect. And what better a topic than ethical dilemmas to really reflect on. Thank you to all the 210 people and the three distinguished panelists. What a great evening. Thank you very much. Stay safe and have a very enjoyable weekend. Thank you very much.
Thank you.